Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now, this week, as Syria marks a decade of war, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said its people have suffered unimaginable violence and repression. Mr. Guterres lamented that in the pandemic, Syria had fallen off the front page. 35 aid organizations have given a stark warning that Syria faces irreversible damage if a political solution isn't found. More than 5 million people have fled the country, and most of them are now living in refugee camps, depending on aid, as there are virtually no prospects of finding any work. But the Norwegian Refugee Council also highlights in a new report the growing needs inside Syria, where more than 80% of the population is now living in poverty and millions have been displaced internally. The country's economy has collapsed, meaning more Syrians struggle to afford basic goods. And as the crisis continues, there could be millions more displacements.
For 10 years, the world has watched Syria spiral into destruction and bloodshed. In that time, Syrians have been subjected to human rights violations on a massive and systematic scale. The parties to the conflict have also repeatedly violated international humanitarian law, so far with absolute impunity. Bombs and mortars have rained down on homes, schools, hospitals and markets. Chemical weapons have caused unspeakable suffering. Cities have been placed under siege, starving civilians. Parties have imposed indefensible restrictions on humanitarian aid. And for much of the civil war, substantial areas of the country were controlled by Security Council designated terrorist groups that subjected many Syrians to unimaginable violence and repression. It is impossible to fully fathom the extent of the devastation in Syria, but its people have endured some of the greatest crimes the world has witnessed this century. And the scale of the atrocities shocks the consciences. Their perpetrators must be held to account if there is to be sustainable peace in Syria. The horrors of the conflict have spared no Syrian family. Around the countries, children have never lived a day without war. Compounding the suffering is an economic collapse and soaring poverty caused by a combination of conflict, corruption, sanctions, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Some 60% of Syrians are at risk of hunger this year. It is imperative that we continue to reach all Syrians in need of humanitarian assistance. More humanitarian access is needed. Intensified cross-line and cross-border deliveries are essential to reach everyone in need everywhere. For 10 years,
the UN Secretary General there, Antonio Guterres. Well, for more about that stark warning about the continuing crisis in Syria as the country marks a decade of war, I'm joined now from Jordan by Samah Hadid, Head of Advocacy in the Middle East for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Somebody said that the way to see the crisis in Syria, and I'm quoting them directly, is to think of the effects of the pandemic on people's lives in the last year and multiply it by about 1,000, then multiply that by 10 years instead of 1 year, and with no end in sight, then you get some notion. Does that give some sense of the impact of a decade of war in Syria?
Absolutely. I mean, 10 years on since the start of the conflict in Syria, the crisis is just worsening. If anything, it's particularly worsening in the areas of humanitarian needs. Hunger is on the rise. We see poverty on the rise across the board, and the economic situation is absolutely in crisis. We see economic deterioration across the board. So, of course, there is certainly the similarity to the pandemic times 100 that has really hit Syria across the past decade. And 10 years on, we still haven't seen an end to the conflict. There's been no political settlement, no lasting ceasefire, and people are living in limbo in Syria, particularly displaced Syrians who we try to assist inside Syria, across the country, who are also in need. We're projecting that 1 million more displacements will be on the horizon over the next decade if the crisis continues unabated.
Yes, and that was going to be my next question, really, because of course, lots of relentless images over the years, over that decade of conflict, of rampaging gunmen and warplanes pushing relentlessly through sort of villages, destroying everything in their path. I mean, where do things stand today?
Well, we certainly need to see a lasting ceasefire and an end to the conflict if we're going to be able to address just the humanitarian needs across the country and also try to rebuild Syrian lives and try to improve conditions across the country. But we also need renewed international commitment. 10 years on, unfortunately, Syria has become a forgotten crisis, a forgotten conflict. And we're seeing countries just completely deprioritize efforts to help end the conflict, but also in terms of providing funding support that's more longer term, that's aimed at, again, trying to build resilience back, restore basic services, restore infrastructure, and help Syrians rebuild their lives. So we're at a critical point, I think, in this particular conflict. And actors, governments who have influence over this conflict need to take a pause and really try to look at ways that can actually address longer term solutions to ending the conflict and to addressing the underlying humanitarian needs across the country. We need renewed international commitment to end the conflict, but also to support Syrians over the long term.
And of course, this week we're marking the 10th anniversary, and your organisation, the Norwegian Refugee Council, came up with a new report, with absolutely shocking details in it. And I'd like to drill down on that a bit later in the programme. But of course, the UN Secretary General, we heard him earlier pointing out that the pandemic has forced the story of Syria off the headlines and the front pages, and that must be a problem, possibly one of the reasons why it's been relegated to the back burner.
There are a lot of reasons why Syria has been relegated to the back burner, as you put it, and deprioritized over the years. We haven't seen a lot of improvements in the situation. Although conflict has subsided to a certain extent to certain areas, the displacement crisis is still ongoing. It does seem like a very protracted crisis, not only inside Syria, but also in the neighboring regions where the majority of Syrian refugees currently reside. So unfortunately, yes, we've seen a lack of commitment to ending the Syria crisis, but also the displacement crisis, which we fear will continue for years to come if we don't see renewed efforts by the international community, by governments in the Middle East region, and also national actors.
We're looking at pictures on our screen just a moment ago of lots and lots of people in that country continuing to live every day as if there is no tomorrow, but also particularly we saw lots of large numbers of young people. So in effect, a lost generation of Syrians.
And this is what's most worrying, I think, about the future ahead. We put in our report that almost over millions of children live in exile now, have only known displacement, do not have access to education opportunities. And of course, the Norwegian Refugee Council is trying to support young people, children, to maintain their access to education, even through the conflict and the crisis. But we are facing a situation where millions of children are losing out of education, face very grim futures and uncertain futures, both inside Syria, but also in the neighboring countries where they reside as refugees. And what's important to note is that although we have seen, yes, education, funding, support, a lot of that is at risk at the moment. We're hearing that donors may cut aid to Syria. And this is incredibly worrying because if the international community, if traditional donors like the UK government, for instance, do cut aid to Syria, we'll see all of these investments that have been made, particularly in the areas of education, really be reversed. So it's absolutely crucial that donors don't turn their backs, don't abandon Syrians in need, and that's particularly young Syrians, children, who do require more certainty, do require more support for their futures.
The problem, of course, is that this is coming at a time of the pandemic where every country in the world is suffering as a result. I mean, with people within people's countries going through a very difficult time. I mean, you mentioned the UK there. Britain's already cut its foreign aid by, in some cases, up to 60%. And I mean, surely you can't blame them for that.
I mean, it's understandable that economies have taken a hit, but what we're hearing is reports of the UK government potentially cutting aid to Syria by 67%. That's enormous. And that will reverse just years of investment that has been made to support, as I was saying, education efforts, supporting children accessing education, health, ensuring protection of the most vulnerable inside Syria and in the region. So it's absolutely important that the international community doesn't turn their backs and abandon Syrians, particularly at a very critical point now, where we see, again, hunger is on the rise, poverty is on the rise. Hunger and food insecurity grew by 4.5 million just in 1 year. There are now over 12 million Syrians who are food insecure, and that is going to continue to worsen and continue to increase as time goes by. So it's really critical that traditional donors who have invested quite a lot in trying to improve conditions inside Syria don't completely abandon Syrians in need. Otherwise, we will see this crisis just continue to worsen over time, and yet another decade of humanitarian needs just grow.
Okay, please stay with us. Would like to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the impact of a decade of war in Syria. Stay with us.
Well, our report sets out what the future drivers and conditions of displacement will be for Syria and the region over the next 10 years. It's a really grim outlook, unfortunately, for Syria moving forward. because if the crisis and conflict continue at its current rate, we will see more displacements in the future. And really look at how communities now are not coping with their current displacement conditions. We're taking a deeper look into what this would mean moving forward. And unfortunately, it's a really dark picture. We know that mounting poverty is in place. We know that hunger is on the rise and economic deterioration is hitting the country widespread, really across the whole country, but also hitting those internally displaced the hardest. And this is our fear. That moving forward, I think we'll see more economic drivers of displacement because of the lack of basic services available, the lack of support available, and just the sheer economic deterioration really facing the country. So the situation and outlook for displaced communities moving forward is very dire indeed. And also taking a look, I think, at the wider region, we're also seeing extreme poverty being faced by Syrian refugees, particularly in Lebanon, and their situation remaining precarious throughout the region as a whole. So 10 years on since the start of the conflict, we're really not seeing any long-term solutions in place to end the displacement crisis. And even though conditions, I think, in neighboring refugee hosting countries are deteriorating, which is incredibly worrying. And the situation for refugees is also worrying because they don't have access to rights, and their conditions are quite impoverished. It really has, been left to neighboring countries to shoulder the responsibility of the refugee crisis. We've seen very, very little resettlement of refugees in high-income countries, in rich countries. Really, the international community has left it up to countries in the region to shoulder this responsibility, and really hasn't stepped up to support the refugee crisis, nor those internally displaced inside Syria. So we really do urge, the international community to step up its support in terms of increasing its resettlement rates of Syrian refugees, and ensuring longer-term support to restoring services, infrastructure, early recovery and livelihood efforts inside Syria to support those who do remain displaced.
And I know you've talked quite a bit, and obviously that's quite important, about the displaced people both in and out of Syria. But what's the latest as far as the conflict itself is concerned? Because, the country is occupied by lots of foreign powers, isn't it? Controlling swathes of territory. Is there still much fighting on the ground? I know you touched on this briefly earlier, but we'll just bring us up to date as far as that is concerned.
Well, whilst the overall conflict has subsided, we still see general insecurity and fighting on the ground. That has also driven displacement and population movements. What's important to note now is that borders are shut to Syrians. They cannot flee for safety outside of Syria. Neighboring countries are not accepting any further asylum seekers or refugees from Syria. So what you have is a situation of really concerning insecurity facing Syrians. And I think if there was to be future large-scale military operations, that would be most concerning for displaced Syrians who really don't have anywhere to go to find safe haven, and would face the offensives, the bombardment that we've seen previously across the decade. So it's absolutely crucial now that there are efforts renewed to ending the conflict once and for all. and to start rebuilding parts of Syria so that we can actually support Syrians who want to return to their areas of origin, who want to rebuild their lives, to reintegrate into communities. But that really needs to start with a political settlement.
You're obviously not a war correspondent, but what about groups like Islamic State? I mean, are they still sort of active, or have they been effectively neutralized? I mean, there are lots of groups operating, or that were operating, in Syria.
There are certainly a lot of groups operating in Syria. I think the role of Islamic State has subsided over recent years, but there are multiple actors on the ground. And I think it's important for all warring parties to the conflict to support peace efforts and a political settlement. We need, a settlement so that communities can rebuild their lives, so that they can access basic services, so that they can address, longer term needs. But this requires a multitude of actors, both inside Syria, in the region, and internationally, to really end this once and for all. Otherwise, we will see another decade of crisis on the horizon for Syrians.
And just briefly, because we've got about 40 seconds or so left, I mean, are there any political or diplomatic moves at all towards peace that you can point to?
Well, certainly there have been international efforts, UN-led efforts. We're seeing now recent announcements by Qatar, Russia, and Turkey to support peace efforts. I think all of this, needs to continue in order to really address this deep crisis. But beyond that, we need continued international aid to Syria and to support Syrians on the ground, to support communities in need. This needs to be in tandem with any political efforts and processes to address the conflict.
Samah, I want to thank you very much indeed. A hugely enlightening interview. Samah Hadid is the head of advocacy in the Middle East for the Norwegian Refugee Council, and she was talking to me from Jordan. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, Washington, and Amman, Jordan, goodbye, and thank you for watching.